The goals of belting includes a sudden change of volume for emphasis, a change in timbre, and a change of breathing patterns compared to classical singing. However, it depends on where in your song you are actually belting to determine where you need to switch breathing patterns. And the reason why I emphasize this is to make sure that you don't disregard every single breathing technique you have learned. It's just when you are belting, we have to strategize our breathing in a different way. Let's go over the definition for belting in today's lesson. Just remember that the belt technique is always in debate and therefore it is subjective. But there are anatomical and acoustic strategies that can help us achieve a belt. So what is belting? According to Joan later, who is a voice therapist and voice teacher who works with elite performers most associated in the Broadway theater community, her take on belting is this. My definition of belting is that it's a high energy sound with lots of ring or brassiness to it that's, in a way, analogous to yelling. It is only sometimes nasal, but always twangy. Keep this perspective of belting in mind. I want you to focus on the part that says high energy sound. We can achieve this energy with how we breathe through the vocal folds. Now, there are other characteristics that determines a belt, but in today's lesson, we are only focusing on breathing. How do we breathe for belting? A singer needs to change up their breathing patterns depending on where they are belting in a song. Some parts of a song will not require a belt. Therefore, you might want to do a breathing pattern that encourages more of an even flow to match the volume and tone of that vocal line. But because belting is a sudden emotional release, a highlight of a song, we need less air pressure, therefore less airflow. This can be confusing to some people, and you might ask, well, if I'm doing less air, how will I sing louder? Remember how I asked you to focus on the belting definition that defines it as high energy sound. It has nothing to do with loudness. However, belting can be loud. I just want you to know that belting is not only about loudness. And if that's the only way you can achieve a belt, that's where you run into vocal problems. So although belting can be loud at times, it is more about the intensity of the emotion that you want to convey to the audience that produces that high energetic performance. And once you get comfortable with developing healthy breathing habits for belting, you can add on loudness later. Now that we established that belting is not about loudness, let's discuss further about breathing for belting. According to Joe Estill, minimal airflow is needed due to the longer closed phases of the vocal folds compared to any other type of phonation. To understand how we need to breathe for belting, we need to understand how the vocal folds operate. When we sing, we produce vibrations at the vocal folds. The vibrations happen when air is moving through the vocal folds and it pulls them together, closing at the bottom first, then the top, and then they come apart to create sound waves. And that is one regular cycle or one vibratory cycle. Closed phase is when the vocal folds come together, effectively blocking passage of air from the lungs. And then air pressure builds up underneath the vocal folds. Open phase is when the vocal folds come apart, releasing air, and that rush of air through the vocal folds causes them to vibrate, which produces the sound waves. Air pressure is the process that begins when we exhale. Air is pushed from the lungs to the vocal folds, and as air reaches the closed vocal folds, air pressure is built underneath the folds, leading them to the open phase. Now let's talk about loudness so that we understand why we are focusing so hard on air pressure. Loudness happens when there is an increase in airflow, blowing the vocal folds wider apart, staying apart longer for one vibratory cycle. So if belting requires longer closed phases of phonation, then we need less airflow to make this happen. This is why we do not focus on loudness. Otherwise, we push too much air through the vocal folds. So if you ever try to take a deep breath and belt, it ends up causing you to crack or sing in a breathy tone because it just doesn't work. However, do not confuse this to never ever taking deep breaths. Again, it really determines what you are doing in a song. Are you belting at a certain spot in your song? Then change your breathing pattern. If there's another part in the song where you need a little bit more legato in your singing, then taking a deep breath is totally fine there. Why do we need to care about air pressure in belting? The first reason to care about air pressure is because if the vocal folds become overly pressed or excess glottal resistance due to the increase in airflow, then you can really cause damage to your vocal folds, affecting vocal longevity. When this is done over and over and over again, it can lead to nodules and strain. Another reason why we need to care about breathing is because if you don't know how to manage that air, we end up shouting or screaming and sound shrill, which is not what we particularly want in a healthy belt. Another reason to understand breathing for belting is to reduce the tendency for fatigue in a song. If you decide to belt the entire song, you will get tired faster. You need to be selective on when you want to belt. Therefore, be selective on your breathing patterns. How about I sing something for you and I want you to watch my air management, how I take in air and how much air I am expelling through my lungs. So anytime I try to go higher, I really have to be careful. I don't want to push more air out in the attempt to reach the higher pitches. That's not how we are going to create the higher pitches. Pushing more air will just make my vocal cords come together more harshly, more pressed. If you want to sing higher, you gotta work on thinning out the coordination of the vocal folds like we mentioned earlier. So let's watch for my posture, my alignment. That's gonna help me breathe a lot better, have more control over my exhale. If I ever slump or collapse, that's when I know I'm gonna have a hard time on a high note, especially if I'm trying to hold on to a little bit more air without expelling too much. Till now, I always got by on my own. I never really cared until I met you. And now it chills me to the bone. How do I get you alone? How do I get you alone? So you might ask, what do I do then to practice this, to get better at my breathing? My suggestion is to work on balanced singing. That means not getting too breathy and not being too pressed. You need just the right amount of air for a clean, healthy flow phonation. That means your vocal folds are coming together firmly, but they're not coming apart because air is going through, but they're not being overly pressed either when air is going through. From there, you can eventually add vocal effects, okay? You can play around with your volume, you can play around with the cry technique or the sob technique to add more emotion, but for now, practice on healthy, balanced singing. All right, that's it for this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something new, but thank you so much for watching. That's all for now, and I'll see you next time.